change our name tags here.
Oh, yes, we should do this, right?
Okay.
You noticed, I didn't. Well, that was just a testimony to General Goldfein's situational awareness, because he noticed which name tag was with which chair. I was going to sit down in the wrong place. Welcome, everyone, to a conversation with our Air Force Chief of Staff. Format, very briefly, we're going to have a little conversation up. Actually, General Goldfein's going to make some opening remarks, and we're going to have a conversation here until about 8:40 or so. And where's the clock? Do we have a clock? Oh, you wave at me. Oh, it's right in front of me. Okay, good. 9:40, pardon me. And then we're going to open this up for audience questions. And so without further ado, let me introduce our guest. General Goldfein is, of course, the Air Force Chief of Staff, still fairly newly minted in that post. Before that, he was the Vice Chief. He has extensive combat experience. He was AFCENT commander, has flown 4,200 hours in various aircraft, and was the first chief, I did not know this, to have flown a remotely piloted aircraft. I could go on and on about him, but we want to hear about his plans and his focus since becoming chief and what his priorities are for the future. So please welcome our Chief of Staff, David Goldfein. Please.
Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Senator, and thanks to AEI as well for putting on this forum. It's really a great opportunity to talk about not only the Air Force, but the Joint Force and where it is that we're heading. And I see, looking around the crowd, there's a lot of friendly faces that I've served with, flown with, worked with overseas. Fozzie, great to see you. It's been a while. So let me talk a little bit just up front to sort of set the table, if I could, for
Sure.
what I know will be a really rich discussion about your Air Force. And one of the challenges that we face as a service is actually articulating and explaining to the American people what it is that we do as an Air Force, because quite frankly, we do so much, and so much of it is under the radar. That is sometimes taken for granted. So I want to take an opportunity to really just talk a little bit about what is your Air Force, what does the air component do for the nation and the Joint Force. And I'll start off by telling you that I'm a guy that took 6 years to get through the Air Force Academy. So engineering is not my strong suit. And so much of what we do is assumed capability that I'm concerned as a service chief that it becomes a little bit like a light switch. And so again, back to my academy days, I couldn't explain to you right now how these lights work, right? I know it has to do with bulbs and wires and power. The one thing I know is that there's a switch over there on the wall, and when I flip the switch, the lights come on. And so what I've come to understand over my career, my adult life, is that light switches equal light. And I don't know exactly what goes into it, but it always happens. So I've come to assume that I will always have light. And so much of what the Air Force does beneath the surface produces light and produces capability and produces key functions for the Joint Force. And so when you think about the Air Force, you've actually got to start by thinking about it in terms of what we do deployed in place. So we got over 200,000 airmen right now that are defending the nation, and you got to start with a nuclear enterprise. So the Air Force has two legs of the triad. We're responsible for 75% of the nuclear command and control to ensure that we connect the commander-in-chief with that capability. And this is a force that we developed in the early 60s. I mean, this was designed, when you go out in the missile fields, it's actually fascinating. I mean, it was designed and built in the 60s. It was upgraded a little bit in the 80s, and we really haven't touched it since. And so we have airmen right now as we speak defending the homeland, and that nuclear deterrent underwrites every military operation on the globe. Whether you want to talk about the diplomacy that we have out there, whether we want to talk about what we're doing in the fight against ISIL, the nuclear deterrent, there's a straight line between what we're doing in the nuclear deterrent and safe, secure, reliable nuclear deterrent and what we do across the globe. We became the stewards of space in 1954 when a guy named Bernie Schriever started developing the rocket enterprise, and that has expanded now to the point where we as an Air Force are responsible for 12 constellations. Everyone who's on a laptop right now or who is on a cell phone, and you take a look at the signal that you're getting, I'm here to tell you, you're getting that signal because I've got airmen right now at Schriever Air Force Base keeping those constellations alive and operating. And so when you take a look at the joint force and what we do across the globe, we have become heavily reliant on the space capability and the space enterprise and what it does. Then you extend it to cyber and what we do in the cyber domain, what we do with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Over 35,000 airmen who are deployed in place that are doing the business of taking all the ones and zeros that we collect, all the data, and turning it into decision quality information. And right now, as we sit, we've got airmen that are on alert at the four corners of the globe. There's airmen right now at Andrews Air Force Base that are on strip alert to defend the homeland and scramble when required. All of these airmen are contributing to the homeland defense and the challenges we face deployed in place. It's important to understand that because these are airmen that I would not deploy forward if a contingency occurred, because they're doing their mission at home. And I could give you no better visual than what we're doing at Creech Air Force Base to give you an example of how we are fighting from home station, but having great impact on the current fight. Then you take a look at what an Air Force does deployed forward, and it starts with our mobility forces. Every just short of shy of 3 minutes, an aircraft is taken off or landing somewhere on the globe to deliver critical supplies or personnel somewhere on the globe. And I would argue that we are a global force because of our global mobility. Many of those bases that we're operating off of from a number of bases across the globe right now are in undergoverned spaces where security is an issue. And we have access to those bases because our special operators are there making the relationships happen and ensuring that we have access to those bases. We have a global strike capability, which means we hold targets at risk for the nation. We hold targets at risk for the president, not only from a global strike capability that we would fly from the homeland, but the strike capability that we have that we're deployed downrange, the extended deterrence that we do for the Pacific, and certainly the air superiority mission that we're responsible for. And so whether you want to talk about striking forces in the fight against ISIL, securing the homeland, providing all of this capability, the reality is you can't find a mission the joint force performs where an airman is not engaged and essential for success. So we're always there. And that's a tough story to tell sometimes because it's such a broad case. When you take a look at our Air Force and look at the state of it today, the challenge we face is that most of those missions have grown over time. And if you look at our 70-year history, as missions have expanded, the Air Force has grown. And while we've gone through ups and downs, the reality is until about the last 25 years, we've had commensurate growth in the service as missions have expanded. But then we hit a turning point, and much of America thinks that they still have the Air Force of 1990. But the reality is, if I'd been the chief in 1990, I'd be speaking to an Air Force of over 1 million, just shy of 1 million active Guard Reserve civilian airmen. Today, I've got about 660,000. If I'd been speaking to an Air Force in 1990, I would have had 134 fighter squadrons from which I would deploy 34 forward to fight Desert Storm. I've got 55 total today across the active Guard and Reserve. If I'd been talking earlier, I would have looked at 11 wings and 36 squadrons to provide deterrent value as a supporting the NATO alliance in Europe. Today, 3 wings, 9 squadrons total. We are just not the same Air Force. And so what's happened is missions have grown, and I project they will continue to grow. Space, cyber, ISR, nuclear, these are not going to come down. So we've had 50,000 airmen leave the Air Force while missions have grown, so we've had a math problem. And so that's why you hear me talking about the fact that where we sit today as an Air Force is we're too small for the resources available and are too big for the resources available, but far too small for what the nation demands of it and what the joint force requires. But we're not just sitting back and admiring the problem. We're moving out on some key initiatives that we're working on. I've called them chief focus areas. I'm hoping we get into some discussion on them during the Q&A. Mm-hmm. The first thing we're looking at is the core structure in our Air Force where airmen thrive, where families thrive, where we build readiness, where we have innovation is at the squadron level. And so with all of these fits and starts and decreases over time, I'm concerned about what the current state of the squadron is, where the mission succeeds or fails in the Air Force. And so we're taking a laser focus on that, and I can talk about that again a little more in the Q&A. We're looking at talent management in the Air Force. Today's airman spends a significant amount of time in a functional area, mastering that functional area in air or in space or in cyber. The future airman, I believe, has got to come to the table with they have a U.S. Air Force on their tape. They understand all three, and they understand the operational integration of all three because they've been exposed to all three. And they understand not only how airspace and cyber come together, but how to combine those with the land component, the maritime component, so that we can sit at the table and ensure that we are producing joint plans that bring all those components together for the Commander-in-Chief and the Secretary of Defense. And so we're looking at the developing and how we strengthen the development of joint leaders and teams. And the third one we're focused in on is multi-domain command and control. And I'm focused on that one because I believe future conflict, the victors will be those who can command and control their forces, who can have a resilient, cyber-secure network that they operate on, that they can produce multiple dilemmas for an enemy at a speed that the enemy can't counter, and deny the enemy the capability of doing the same. That's going to win. And that's a core mission of the United States Air Force, and so we're leading the effort as we think through that. So we're an Air Force right now today that has a plethora of missions that we perform every day. There are so many of these missions that we do that if the light didn't come on, if the switch was flipped and that light didn't come on, it would fundamentally change the way we have to operate as a joint force. And so it's a great opportunity here today to get a chance to talk about it.
Well, thank you, and I almost feel like we should just let you handle the whole 40 minutes. And you mentioned too many missions for the resources you have. We have too many topics for the time we have, but I do want to let you elaborate on the health of the force, what you're doing to fix it, and talk a little bit. You touched on it about this subject. You know, readiness is something people do talk a lot about in this town, in part because you can get your arms around certain aspects of it. We can understand if the pilots are not flying enough hours to stay trained. I mean, the average person can get that.
Yeah.
We can understand if there are too many accidents in one service or another because the training isn't there and maintenance isn't there, that sort of thing. But readiness is actually a broader concept than that.
Sure is.
I mean, one of the points you've often made is ready for what?
Yeah.
Right? So could you discuss readiness in that broader context, what you're doing, because a lot of what you're doing addresses readiness in the broader context, I know.
Yep.
And also, maybe elaborate a little bit on an aspect of having too few people doing too many missions. If op tempo was, I mean, my feelings are, if op tempo is too high, I should give you a pen to write all this down. If op tempo is too high, you stress out the force to the point where then retention of the people you've got becomes a difficulty, and you're constantly trying to stay out of that spiral,
Right.
if you would. So you might want to talk about numbers a little bit at that point, too.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. You know, I'll tell you that I do, when I'm talking about readiness, I always throw back a question first, because you get to have an informed discussion about readiness, you do have to talk about ready for what. But I've added another piece to that. I'd say ready for what and when. Mm-hmm. Because you got to have both the what is it that you're trying to be ready for, and when do you need to be ready for it. Mm-hmm. And if you can have the answer to those two questions, you can actually have a meaningful discussions. And sometimes, I'll be honest with you, we're a little bit guilty of briefing ourselves. You know, you've seen them, you know, stoplight charts, red, yellow, green, right? And the question is, okay, so what does that actually mean? I mean, what does it mean when I'm saying high risk or significant risk? And one of the things that General Dunford has done and has been leading the effort on that I completely support is this idea of comprehensive joint readiness. And what does that really mean? And how do we articulate the state of our readiness to our civilian leadership and decision makers? If you were to ask me in the ready for what question, ready for what and when, am I ready to continue the fight against violent extremism for the next decade at the current pace and rate? And the answer to that is yes, I can sustain that. Everyone I send downrange is ready. That's where I put the supervision, that's where I put the parts, that's where I get the flying hours, that's where I put tails forward that can get that. So if that's the mission, as the Chief Staff of the Air Force, I'm telling you, I can sustain that. If the answer to that question is, are you ready to sustain that op tempo, sustain a safe, secure, reliable nuclear deterrent, ensure that we're ready to defend the homeland, and ensure that I'm ready to plus up when General Robinson calls for more forces, which she will do if there's a contingency, deter, assure, and execute a campaign against a near-peer threat, a China or a Russia, or a medium threat, an Iran or a North Korea, then that's why you've seen every one of the service chiefs testify that we're at high levels of risk. Because it's the simultaneity of those events that causes our readiness to be in challenge. Because if you were to walk on the flight line today at Bagram Air Base, what you'd see would be very high state of readiness and relatively high morale. If you went back home and walked the same flight lines of the bases that produced that readiness, you would see low states of readiness and real challenges in morale. Because pilots who don't fly, maintainers who don't maintain, controllers who don't control, are not going to stay with the company if they're not being given the tools to compete and be the best they can be. And so readiness is a function of what have I got forward and what do I have back home to be able to generate the air power you need to be able to do the missions we're required. Add on top of that the way I describe what an Air Force does for the nation, which is certain number of things deployed in place and certain number of things that we do deployed forward. And so between the bookends I described, which is I'm too big for the resources that I have and too small for what the nation demands, in between those two bookends lives risk. Mm-hmm. And my concern is that risk very often is laid on the backs of our airmen. And that goes to your point of having not enough airmen spread across so many mission sets, many of which are in a growth industry. I mean, look at ISR. I mean, it's been an exponential growth over just the last 15 years. We're flying 60 caps today. That's just the unmanned number of lines we're flying. You add to that the number of manned lines we're doing, all the constellations we're doing, and you take a look at that industry, it's been a huge growth industry. I don't predict that industry coming down.
It's going to continue. Yeah.
But yet think about it, we've built that industry with all of that exponential growth while 50,000 airmen left the Air Force. That's why we have a math problem right now.
Yeah, and you stress the force to the point where you're constantly fighting against morale issues as well. And one of the things that frustrates me, you can comment this on you, it's generally true, is it not, that once readiness, as you define it, gets to the point where it's a significant problem, it ends up costing you more to fix it than you saved in the first instance. Is that a general rule of thumb that you would agree with?
Well, I'll give you a perfect example. So we went into sequestration with the BCA budget, and we grounded every squadron that wasn't either preparing for or in the fight. Grounded them. So those squadrons stopped flying. Those maintainers stopped maintaining. Those air traffic controllers stopped controlling. Those munitions builders stopped building. All of those folks, all of the chain of events that has to occur, to the fingerprints that are all over an aircraft when that thing gets airborne, I lost readiness across the board. So you got to think about this from an enterprise perspective. You don't just reverse that overnight. I had pilots that lost landing currency, let alone their capabilities in the high-end spectrum. So you don't just build that overnight. We're still recovering. We're still recovering from that event when we were sequestered the first time.
Yeah, I think it's one big problem that we could address, and this is really not your job, is we do a very poor job of educating incoming members of Congress and senators, particularly if they're not going to be on the HASC or the SASC, about what the department does, the breadth of it. And I think there's a lot of thinking that because they're not going to get up on the acronyms in a 1-hour session that we can't communicate these broader truths. Mm-hmm. But I really think we could. I've actually talked to leaders of Congress about this. I mean, you mentioned training. In the Army, for example, when you train in brigade levels, if you miss a training cycle, I mean, for the Army to catch that up in terms of, and you have the same problem. It's
right.
Probably not quite as big as the Army, but maybe you would argue with me about that. It's a huge issue, and yet I think people making these decisions really don't have any consciousness of that, and we could do a much better job of it. You mentioned numbers, and you've talked about, I think you need 20 25 to 30,000 more airmen. Your predecessor, General Welsh, thought even a little bit more than that. Just take a minute and talk about where you'd want to focus that. Is it maintainers? Is it air mobility? Is it, you have an issue with fighter pilots now, I know. Is it all the above? I mean, where would you focus that?
So we've got a prioritized list of exactly where those airmen would go. Right now, first and foremost, because this is a focus on rebuilding readiness and because people are our number one limitation in the Air Force right into rebuilding readiness, I'm going to put it first and foremost where I need them on the flight line and maintenance, flight line maintenance, so I can generate the sorties I need. After that, I've got to continue to put them in the cyber because remember, we're only about 60% complete with the buildup of our cyber mission teams that we contribute, and all the services are doing the same thing when it comes to the cyber mission. Space has become a contested place, and we are the service that is responsible for the vast majority of the space capability. And I've got to make sure that we can fight should a war on the surface extend into space. And so that requires a different mindset. And so we're re-looking at, and we're actually shifting based on a vision that was put in place by General Hyten, who's now at Strategic Command and now being carried on by General Raymond, to take a look at the space domain and normalize it the way we have normalized other domains. And so now if you were to go out to Schriever Air Force Base, what you would find is that we have actually built a dwell in space, which is not something we've previously talked about. Dwell being how much time are you deployed and how much time you're at home. What that translates to is how much time are you engaged in the fight and how much are you training and preparing for the fight, because you got to be able to do both. And so I've got to have time on my space operators to train them. At the same time, I've got to have them continue to be employed in the fight. So that's a growth industry. So you take a look at all those areas, that's where you're going to see us placing people. But you'll see, for me, placing people where I need to fix readiness shortfalls. Because the demand signal on the Air Force across all these mission areas, I go back to, you can't name a mission that the Joint Force performs that you're not going to find an airman engaged and essential to success. So I'm not expecting any relief on any of these mission areas, and I'm not asking for any relief on what the Joint Force requires. I just got to make sure I got troop to task to be able to sustain that readiness at the level the nation expects over time.
And let's get into space and then also on the nuclear side, both of which you talked about. I know you're eager to talk about space in particular. Talk a little bit about the broader environment. You mentioned high-end competitors. I think another thing that we're not fully conscious of, or the broader political leadership network isn't fully conscious of, is the extent of the challenge from high-end competitors, and China and Russia being specific, which doesn't mean that they're going to be enemies, but we have to view them, in my view, as potential competitors. And they have analyzed our strengths, our weaknesses, and what they think the conflict of the future is going to look like. I'm on the China Commission. The Chinese information dominance is a hugely important part of what they're aiming at. So where do you see the space enterprise going as we turn attention to it? What would you like to see us do, at least in the broader sense, with a space architecture as we upgrade, modernize, replace, which I agree with you, it just has to happen.
Yeah, you know, so in a previous life, I got to be the director of Joint Staff for General Dempsey. And I used to track the percentage of meetings that we would prepare him for to go to the Oval Office or go over to a Principals Committee meeting. And during my time as the DGS, it was about an 80-20 split, 80% violent extremism, Middle East, 20% rest of the globe. I give Secretary Carter a lot of credit for giving us, across the national security enterprise, a new framework to look through, to look at the global challenges we face. And you've heard it perhaps described as the 4+1, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremism. +1 is a condition that we have got to continue to work. The space enterprise plays directly in all of those. And so as we take a look at the future of space, I'm anticipating and looking forward to a very healthy dialogue with Congress about where it is that do we need to take space in terms of organization and in terms of investment for the future. And in my mind, there are two fundamental elements of this discussion. The first is, are we looking to try to normalize space as a domain that we operate in, just like we operate at sea, on land, in the air? I'm one that believes that the more we can normalize space as a domain that's part of the way the Joint Force operates, is a very healthy way of looking at the future, as opposed to trying to carve it into something that's unique and different, that has its own lexicon and terminology that only folks that work in the space business understand. I think we got to go in the other direction, which is how do we normalize it? And the second is, what specifically are we focused on fixing?
I'm glad you explained what you meant by normalization,
Yeah.
because one of my jobs is to ask the simple question, or the dumb, which I'm good at, asking the dumb questions. So I was going to ask what you meant by normalization, but you explained it. That's good.
The second part is I'm going to continue to ask the question. Let's just focus on specifically are we trying to fix in space? Because as the Air Force, we've been the steward of space since 1954. But I am eager to talk about where we can take this in the future. And there are 4 elements that I think we got to have a dialogue about. The first is, how do we organize, train, and equip the space enterprise for the future? That traditionally is a service and a service chief responsibility. So as the force that has the predominance of the space enterprise, how do we ensure that we're organized to organize, train, and equip? Second is, how are we organized to operate in space? And operations in space is a combination of looking at all of the stakeholders and players in space, commercial, allies, partners, right? I mean, there's a number of folks operating in space. And so how do we ensure that we've got an organizational structure that brings in all of the elements that you probably have heard, and we can talk about the JIXPOC.
Yeah, let me just, this is a real challenge for all of you in your enterprise, because we have the same problem in cyber. I think never before has, the warfighting and deterrence enterprise, the military enterprise, been so mixed up on so many levels with the civilian enterprise.
Right.
And from a congressional standpoint, you have huge governance issues.
Yeah.
I mean, who owns what?
And what are the authorities?
Yes.
That's right.
And so you confront this. We had to do with cyber a lot. I haven't resolved that at all. And I'm sorry. I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole. But insofar as you really have to have DoD involved in this.
Yeah.
There's an issue now with DoD involvement with private, and the commercial side of it, perhaps regulating the commercial, which is something that you all aren't used to doing either, right?
That's right.
So it's a real challenge to try and resolve these questions. And I'm glad you've spotlighted that as one of the big ones. It's very difficult. We haven't really begun to think about it very
Oh, yeah,
hard.
Senator, but I'll tell you that the way I look at it, far more opportunity than challenge.
No, good.
There's huge opportunity. I personally am excited about the growth of commercial space because I think it provides incredible opportunity for us to partner. And so when you look at operations in space, we as the uniformed military got to look beyond defense and assurance and reliance on space. We got to look at how do we operate in space. That's why it's the second element. The third is acquisition. How do we ensure that we are organized with the right authorities to be able to acquire what we need in space? And space, how do we normalize space and think about it the same way we do in the air domain in terms of a family of systems approach, as opposed to each constellation doing its own individual work? How do we connect them up in meaningful ways so 1 + 1 = 3? And the fourth element we got to talk about is policy and strategy. And that's beyond a service chief's realm, but because I will execute against the policy guidance I'm given, I do think we have to have a discussion at the national level about how we're organized for that. So I'm one that, quite frankly, I'm really looking forward to the debate. I think there's a lot of really good work that we can ahead and huge opportunities.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I agree about the opportunities. It's just right now, getting from here to there, this is an awful lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
And you're going to be, all of us have so many other things to do too, but it's essential, and I'm glad you mentioned it as a priority. So I want, in the time of it, to make certain I let you go on a little bit more about the nuclear enterprise, and I'll just preface it by saying, really glad that you began your remarks by relating the importance of the whole defense establishment to the broader foreign policy and the foundation of America's influence in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fond of saying that at a fundamental level, defense policy is foreign policy,
Yeah.
right? And the nuclear enterprise is a classic example of that. I mean, for example, it's an absolute foundation of our foreign policy to prevent proliferation, right? But that depends in part on the health of the nuclear umbrella and the nuclear enterprise here. So talk a little bit about where you want to see your piece of that go. What guideposts, are you looking at? I'll give you a few more minutes to elaborate.
So I'm a proud graduate of the Foreign Service Institute and the State Department Senior Seminar. So I spent a year with 31 of us who were all spent a year studying what makes America tick, and then most of my classmates went on to be ambassadors. And so in that year, one of the things I learned was, and it's an opportunity for me to actually champion the courage and the professionalism of our foreign service. And I learned that when we were swapping war stories, mine paled in comparison, in many ways, to what many of our young foreign service officers do around the globe every day. So I see a lot of what I do in terms of the United States Air Force and safe, secure, reliable nuclear deterrent as enabling their diplomacy and what they're doing every day. We got to remember that we lost 75 million people between World War I and World War II. When you go back and do the math, that was 33,000 people lost every day. We can't even fathom that kind of loss. Since the introduction of a safe, secure, reliable nuclear enterprise, no two nuclear powers have gone to war, and we have had nowhere near that kind of casualty rate, despite the fact that we've had conventional conflicts. So I'm one that believes that we started 3 legs of a triad because each leg brings a certain key attribute to the triad that all comes together to support the STRATCOM commander in the mission that he executes for the President and the Secretary of Defense. We built the missile part of the leg because it gives you responsiveness. It is the most responsive leg of the triad, and that's what when we do the nuclear command and control that keeps the President connected, that's where he can go to, and he can quickly use that force. And if you look at the cost to an adversary of going after 450 different sites with the number of munitions they would have to do, there's a cost point to them in terms of the deterrent value of the missile fields. We built the air leg because you wanted to have flexibility. It's the one arm that you can actually call back. You can dial yields. You can do things, and so it's the most flexible arm. And God forbid, on our worst day as a nation, the submarine force is the most reliable. It's going to be the one that's going to be there, right at the end. It's the hardest one to find. It's the hardest one to target. It's the least vulnerable. So if we're going to walk away from that triad, I just want to make sure in the debate that we understand the attributes that we're walking away from. And I'm one that believes that you actually need all 3 legs, and we've got to modernize them, and we haven't modernized them. So I brought a visual aid for you here. So I don't know if anybody's seen one of these in a while, but this is an 8-inch floppy disk. All right? We require these today in the missile fields, 8-inch floppy disks. It's time to modernize.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, as I said, I had too many questions for the time available, but I'm sure that we'll cover them in some audience questions or press questions. So look, I've done this a number of times. There's no way I can be scientific on this. I'm going to try and pick from different parts of the world and do the best I can. Yes, front row right here. Yeah.
Good morning, General Colin Clark.
Hey, Colin.
Senator McCain has said in his white paper.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I should have said, okay, wait for the mics. It's my fault.
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. Senator McCain has said that he'd like to see 300 lower tech fighter aircraft, arguing basically they can sort of fill a lot of the jobs that are currently done by things that we don't need 5th gen to do those jobs. Good idea, bad idea, why?
Great idea. And I'll tell you why. Because I think we're 15 years into a long campaign in the Middle East. This will continue to be a coalition fight. And so we've got to continue to evolve and look at the way we prosecute and sustain this campaign against violent extremism that may not stay contained into the current locations and locales as it goes. And it's going to be a campaign that we've got to continue to fight by, with, and through allies and partners. That's our strategy, and I think it's the right strategy. So if you're looking at sustaining this campaign, I go back to my ready for what and when. So if that's all we're doing, I can take all of the forces that I currently put towards the fight, the F-22s, the high-end capability. I can continue to sustain that as long as I'm willing to accept the risk that I have back home. I don't think that's acceptable risk given the global challenges we face. And again, back to the 4+1 framework of global challenges, I believe as the Air Chief, I got to sustain both levels of readiness. So if I'm going to build readiness over time in both of these campaigns, then we got to look at new ways of doing business in the future. And one of the new ways of doing business, I think, is absolutely spot on in his paper, is to take a look at, is there a more sustainable model for the future that would be less costly, that I could entice foreign partners, allies, and coalition members to partner with us on, that could reduce the overall cost and would also contribute to raising the readiness I have on those forces that are going to be required immediately if any other campaign kicks off. You know, as an Air Force, we can't have tiered readiness. And the reason we can't have tiered readiness is because if you study the operational plans of the combatant commanders, with 120 days of any of their campaigns kicking off, 80% of the Air Force is required to go forward. 80% of the Air Force required to go forward. So when you hear us talk about a metric that says I've got to have 80% of the force ready for high-end conflict, that's why. We don't build an Air Force to serve the Air Force. We build an Air Force to serve the combatant commanders, and we organize, train, and equip to send ready forces into the fight. And I got to be ready for what's right around the corner. And so if getting into a low-end capability that it can actually help me with building and sustaining the coalition lowers costs and improves my readiness, I'm all for it.
Yeah,
Is the Scorpion a good idea for it?
Excuse me?
Is the Scorpion a good possibility for it?
Is the score?
Scorpion.
Scorpion.
It's one of the ones we're going to look at. And what we've done is we've actually gone out to industry, and one of the authorities that I have as a service chief now is to run experiments. And so we're actually right now looking at an experiment where we go out to industry and say, what do you have commercial off the shelf, low cost that can perform this mission? And we're going to do an experiment and just sort of see what's out there. And I'm expecting many of the companies to come forward.
Low end is maybe part of the answer to some of the industrial base issues too, isn't it?
It is, and I'm always reminded by my buddies, my battle buddies, and my special operators that say, you know the difference between a low end and high end fight is. Low end is when they're shooting at you. High end is when they're shooting at me, right? So we do have to be a little careful about. I don't want to describe low end in any way, shape, or form as insinuating that we are not totally committed to the close air support mission. And that is we are going to fly to the sound of the guns, or we're going to die trying.
Right.
And so when I say low end, it's more of a how do I perhaps use a weapon system and a family of systems that are lower cost in a permissive environment that I can sustain over time and use in a more coalition-friendly manner.
I didn't mean unimportant. I meant lower ends and some more simple. I'm going to take one more over here, and then I'll go back over here. All right, that gentleman right there on the end.
Thank you very much. Patrick Tucker with Defense SWAT. Good to see you again. Two-part question on current operations in Syria. There's a report out yesterday that RAF airmen are being thwarted in some of the sorties that they're doing over Syria by Russian information operations. I wonder if you could comment on that. And more broadly, we also know that Russia is moving very sophisticated anti-aircraft systems into the area. Are you worried at all that Russia is creating an increasingly non-permissive environment over Syria? And how do you deal with that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, it's been an evolution, not a revolution. Right? This has been a continual evolution over time in terms of the Russian footprint there and how the campaign. I mean, it's like General Austin used to say. You can't find there's not an inch on the planet that's more complex than Syria, right? And so as Russia changes its footprint there, it just adds to the complexity. And so right now, the Air Component Commander, Lieutenant General Harigian, at his headquarters, has a phone line that we actually have a colonel who's a Russian speaker who talks to his counterpart to make sure that we deconflict activities. And to date, it's been working pretty well. And when we do have a hiccup, it's an immediate communication that goes back and forth. Can that be improved? Sure. Am I concerned about it as an airman in terms of the complexity of the mission? Yes. Is Russian activity affecting our operations from a coalition in terms of where we fly, where we operate, and what we need to achieve? No.
All right, that lady back there had her hand up first.
Thank you. Hi, General Goldfein, Lee John Greco, Flight Global. Last week, Mattis in his hearing supported the triad with what seemed like some reservations about LRSO. I'm curious to see if you've spoken with General Mattis about the need for LRSO. And secondly, going off of your floppy disk that you brought with you here, the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board is doing a study about networked nuclear weapons. So I'm also curious about any of your concerns on networked weapons, and perhaps you could talk about the security that you might get with that old school floppy disk.
Yeah, thanks. It is tough to hack. Yeah, that's right. You know, so first, very short answer to the first question, which is no, I haven't had any discussions with General Mattis. And you know the rules in terms of doing anything that presumes confirmation. And General Mattis, you know, we all know that. Those of us who have been privileged to be confirmed by the Senate. So there's been no conversations at all. Second, in terms of networking nuclear weapons, that's a much broader discussion at a policy level, right? Because that goes into START treaty, that goes into how we, you know, operate. And so, you know, I go back to, you know, it's a parallel discussion with what I outlined for you in space, right? Is I fully expect that, like every new administration, they will perform a nuclear posture review. And we will step back and take a look at the entire nuclear enterprise and have a discussion not only about, you know, how we modernize it, because all of the legs are coming due together. And so you've seen the numbers. I mean, when you take a look at the 2023 timeframe and beyond, you know, some pretty big bills are coming due. So we got to have a dialogue and a debate about the nuclear enterprise and what we're going to do with it. But just as important to me, and a dialogue that I'm really looking forward to having, which is what actually is the future of deterrence in the 21st century? Because it's a broader discussion than just the nuclear deterrent. You have to bring now into the dialogue the global commons and our capabilities there in space and in cyber and in the maritime domain and in the undersea domain and those areas where we have advantages. And so I'm looking for a debate and a dialogue about the future of deterrence in the 21st century. And while I think there's some new capabilities that we've got to include in that dialogue, I would also tell you there are certain parts of deterrence that will never change. And for me, it's a bit of a math issue. It's capability times will. And the times is important, not plus, times, right? Because if either side is 0, it equals 0. So you got to have the will and the capability, and your adversaries have got to believe it. And so, again, back to, I'll also tie it to multi-domain command and control and why that's so important, because if victory of the future goes to that leader that can command and control his or her forces, that can operate and produce dilemmas from multiple domains, then it can have the cyber resiliency to operate at a speed that's going to be required in the 21st century and deny your enemy the ability to do the same, that's going to be the victor in future conflict. So how that ties together in terms of the nuclear enterprise, there will always be a straight line connection. But I'm looking forward to the dialogue about the future of deterrence.
So quickly, is there alignment within the Pentagon on the need for that weapon, or is this something that the services are sort of jockeying over right now?
You know, actually, I think there's alignment, but as we go through, you know, administration change, I think we're going to have a healthy debate about all elements of it, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
You know, I've never had a discussion with a chief, the current chief or retired, and have some served on a number of these commissions, where the subject of greater strategic clarity has not come up. And you just, when you're talking about the future of deterrence, because you can't plan a force unless you know what you want to do with the force.
Right.
And that's so strongly related to the broader strategic issues of American foreign policy, which, truth be told, we have not done a lot of good work on since, I'm not about you, but I'm talking about the political authority since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Just what is it we're trying to do in the world and why? And you, at every time it comes up.
Well, you know, I'll tell you, so Admiral Miller and I fought together in the Middle East when he was the maritime component commander and I was the air component commander. And we fought under a commander at the time named General Jim Mattis. And General Mattis gave us two, Fozzie, tell me if I wrote those, he gave us two pieces of guidance, commander intent. He said, number one, I expect vicious harmony among you, right? I expect you guys, you know, doctrine is interesting and it's a starting point of the discussion, but I expect vicious harmony when it comes to you component commanders working together across all the domains to solve my problems. And the second thing he told us, which was interesting, he said, and don't tell me you can't fight with all of your exquisite communications capabilities.
Vicious harmony, I know a lot of marriages like that, too.
Yeah.
Back that gentleman there.
Yes, General, in the fabric of your triad, what are you most proud of Air Force pilots?
We go to war with our values. And what that means is, and I'll go back to a story. When I was aide to a guy named General Mike Ryan, he was when I was working for him, he was the air component commander that built and then we executed the first campaign over Bosnia that resulted in the Dayton Accords. And we were up at a NATO military committee meeting, and everybody was, you know, coming up to him and congratulating him on this great campaign. And I was a young major at the time, and he had a response that I've never forgotten. He would look at him and he'd say, you know, if it results in a better peace on the ground for those who live there, then it will all have been worth it. And it was a reminder to me that what it is that we're working for when we apply military power. And when we do that, we bring our values to the table. And so what I'm most proud of is, you know, we train our young pilots. I'll talk about fighter pilots or RPA pilots. I mean, we train them to be hunters. We train them to be aggressive. We train them to go after the enemy. And do you know how many times a day they withhold fire? I mean, when you're flying an airplane, right, and you're hang up the stick, they have this little thing called a red button called a pickle button, right? And that's what you use to deliver order. When you hit the pickle button, bombs come off, right? And normally when you fly, your thumb rides about a half an inch above the pickle button. That's half an inch from hero to zero. Because when you get it wrong, you get it very wrong. And if it's not producing a better peace on the ground for those who live there, then we're not doing what the nation is asking us to do. So I'm most proud of the fact that we have been so disciplined that we have done everything in our power to reduce civilian casualties, and we've kept our North Star as we've gone into combat. I'm proud of that.
Yeah, I always get upset when people portray the whole enterprise in a very cynical way, because that's not how the people doing it think, and I agree. Go back over here, yes. Yeah.
Michael Gordon, New York Times.
Hey, Mike.
Sir, I'd like to follow up on a previous question. The Russian Defense Ministry announced today that it carried out a joint airstrikes in Syria with the Turkish Air Force. And they said this involved Turkish F-16s, F-4s, a variety of Russian aircraft that they specified hit 36 targets, that there had been coordination between the two countries' general staffs, and they had picked the targets together. Does it concern you that a NATO ally is conducting joint operations in Syria with the Russians, and what are the implications of that?
So it certainly adds to the complexity. You know, one of the biggest challenges we faced with, you know, dealing with the Russians there is the say-do gap. They say they're going after ISIL, but their actions don't seem to align with what they say they're there to do. And so we struggle sometimes to understand exactly what their objectives are because we're not seeing them act in the way that aligns with what they have said they're there to do. And so we keep a pretty close eye on that. And so it adds to the complexity. As long as the actions align to go after ISIL, which is what we have all aligned with as our common enemy, then I'm not as concerned. When those actions by any of the players over there deviate from that objective, then it becomes a far more complex challenge for us to move forward in the overall campaign.
And you're not concerned that they have a military, at least a tactical alliance with Turkey? What about the Turkish?
I'm not concerned. I'm not concerned right now, but I think we're all watching very closely to see how this goes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, General. When you were racking and
Mike's
stacking-
coming.
Oh, sorry. When you were racking and stacking the personnel requirements for the Air Force, where do fighter pilots and RPA pilots fit in there?
It's part of who we are and what we do. I would say that as Chief Staff of the Air Force, I love everyone equally. And so I don't have any particular part of my Air Force that I feel is more important than the other part, because they're all connected together. And because we fight as a family of systems, we don't bring silver bullets to any fight. What we bring is a family of systems, and they're all connected together. So those fighter pilots are actually connected to the person right now sitting up in, F.E. Warren, right, near Cheyenne, who's a Garden Missile Base, and they're all connected, and they're all required. So, but if you don't mind, let me use this as an opportunity to talk about the pilot shortage we face, because that is important. I'm one who believes that, again, you look through the lens of challenge or opportunity. I mean, I think as a senior leader, my job is to try to find the opportunity presented in every challenge. And so I see an opportunity here. But it's a national challenge. The reality is, we as a nation are not producing the amount of pilots we need to source the commercial requirement, the business requirement, the private requirement, and the military requirement. And that military requirement is also international. And so the question that I'm asking, as I try to look at just what I have to do within the United States Air Force, is how do we get the supply-demand tables better balanced? And is there a national approach we ought to take, working in partnership with Congress, to look at an incentive structure for those that are looking at the business of producing pilots that can actually increase our supply to better meet demand? Right now, FAA rules stipulate that a commercial aviation company has got to hire a pilot with 1,500 hours, right, to fly for an airline. I become a very attractive source of pilots based on that, because I've now got a lot of folks who have flown 1,500 hours. So I could look at, how do I keep what I have longer, or we could look at this nationally and say, is it time to relook at that requirement? Given the challenge we face, does 1,500 hours make sense? And what's magic about 1,500 hours? And if we were to change that, and we were to change the incentive structure for where we produce pilots, could we change the supply-demand imbalance that we face right now in different ways? Internal to the Air Force, I will tell you that I very much appreciate Congress's support for allowing us to increase the bonus, because I don't have enough money to pay people to stay. But if I can remove some financial burdens, that's helpful. More important to me, that I think will be the incentive to allow airmen to choose to stay, is that focus on the squadron I talked about earlier. Because here's when I go out and I talk to, I've always got, in a crowd, are great Air National Guardsmen, and Air Force reservists, many of whom fly for the airlines and fly for the military, full-time airline, part-time in the military. And I also ask them the same question. I said, all right, so here's the question. Any of you who fly for the airlines, how many times has the airline called your family to check in on them when you've been on a trip, to see how they're doing? And not one hand has ever been raised. ever. Not because they're not right, it's just because it's not their culture. That's our culture. That's what we do. You know, I asked them, hey, when you're going into work and you're getting ready to fly your airline up, is it a job or a calling? And vast majority will tell me it's a job. When you put on your flight suit and you drive through the gate and you go in there to defend the nation, job or calling? It's a calling. That's what will keep people in. And so we're going to revitalize that across our Air Force because I think people want to stay.
And that strikes me as a good way to end our discussion. We are at 10 o'clock, and we want to be sensitive to your time. Thank you, Chief.
Oh, thank you.
And thank all of you for being here. Great job.